Welcome to Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean Part 21. Hope you've enjoyed the series thus far. This should be the ultimate episode today. And what we're going to go into and speak about is just the independence movement that sort of swept through the Caribbean and the global lower order that wanted to sort of stand up to the powers that be that were the European colonial powers of last century and just get their independence. Really, we're going to touch on what it may have developed into for countries that opted to stay as part of the colonial empires that it is that they were attached to at the end of the last century, and then also just speak about the struggle for sovereignty and keeping hold of the land that you've worked for 300 years, and most notably within the Caribbean. So that's all we're going to speak about today. Let's get into this. Let's start off. Independence motion was the next revolutionary concept to sweep through the island chain. With Europe engaged in two wars of economic depression in between 50 years that had colonial powers taking the liberty of recruiting ex-colonial subjects for war as Europe faced the brink of dissolution. Contribution to the war effort from ex-colonies would have delivered a sense of connection to the crown. Amicable international relations would have been at their best since emancipation. Europeans, in a state of recovery, relied heavily on ex-colonies in the Caribbean to become economic migrants, but at home the one drop had begun to raise its decibel level as Caribbean people still harboured grudge. They were on the short end of the deal monetarily. Inspired by the birth of civil rights and black power movements in America, the Caribbean islands sought to sever ties with former colonial masters but remain cordial and endeavour to achieve a relative manner of equality that would understandably see them steer and enter their own ship into the race of international pecking order, aiming for a level playing field of access to equality on an international scale. So there we have it. The first half of the last century was dominated by two wars, which we know about, First and Second World War. In between, there was a financial depression. So the world was experiencing significant economic issues, and obviously Europe was worrying about being blitzed to pieces, basically, because they were fighting and they had the superior weaponry exacted against themselves in a funny way. So they'd been more bombed than anywhere else in the world, you could say, right? But obviously, in between that time, who would ever have had ex-colonies would have lent on those colonies significantly and would have used their citizens as auxiliary soldiers or soldiers. Would have raided the bank, if you know what I mean, and looked to sort of exploit them during these times because they would have needed them to finance their war effort, as France may have done with places like Vietnam. They would have lent on them and looked to get what they could get out of these countries just to make sure that they get through the war of what it is they were going through within Europe, But during this time, more and more you see black civil rights in America going off everywhere, and obviously it's gone through to the Caribbean, and now countries across the world by the 1950s are looking to serve papers of independence and become separate but still cordial from who it was with their colonial masters. It was pretty much the end of the colonial era for the Europeans across the world, although they still held, for me, the financial reins of power and got to decide on what was valuable, and basically the system of finance and instruments that make the world go round, you could say, are still sort of operated and run in a Eurocentric way. So sometimes products that should be of higher value, that would put the third world in significantly a better position financially, are sometimes not held to the value that they should be, based upon what the mechanisms, the financial instruments and mechanisms state they are, or the going rate is in Europe, So some will say that, it's almost fixed to a Eurocentric way of life, but it does give you the opportunity on a level playing field, you could say, in some respects, to okay, right, we do recognise it is that way, so let's play the game in that way. And some countries have, like in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of countries like exploding in terms of like their economy, and sort of giving them a run for our money, and maybe the leaders in the next century, or next 100 years. So it's just not all one way. It's rigged to benefit them, yes, but you can work it to your benefit as well if you introduce the right political measures, and you all go as one. But that's another story altogether. And then obviously in the 1950s you had the Windrush generation, or this was all across Europe, where the ex-colonies came to Europe because of many people needing to rebuild their country, and needing people to work in places where like loss of life would have been detrimental to, like, not just detrimental, but like they needed to rebuild their countries basically. So that's when like people like my grandparents or whatever Caribbean people came here in their droves in the 1950s, and also from India as well, respectively. So that's where we're at, and it was to help the UK. And to be honest with you, like some people, and they're not white, but I shouldn't say this, yeah, they make you feel like you shouldn't be here or be in this country sometimes. This is individual to me, right? And I'm thinking to myself, right, sometimes like my ancestor is really super connected with the UK, whether they like it or not. Like my ancestor could have been there 200-300 years. It's been significant. It's had a significant role to play in the Industrial Revolution, just like it's part of the story of the country. So that's of my choosing whether I like to stay here or move on or whatever, and all the rest of it, not of yours. Like my ancestors sweat, blood and tears for this country, if not me, But do you know what I mean? Can you say the same? Maybe so, but yeah, I know my ancestors definitely like has a decision on whether they can stay here or not, and whether they see it as home or not. Not you. Do you know what I mean? And your agenda. But anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about something different. Let's move on. The 20th century was to become the forward rhythm motion of independence. In domino effect, one by one, islands of the Caribbean began peacefully legislating independence with stoic diplomacy. Every few years post-World War II, many islands would table the claim for sovereignty. Some would hold referendum and elect to remain attached to their respective colony. For example, Martinique and Guadeloupe elected to stay as French protectorate. This gave them, in some ways, first world privilege, and would have made entry for European institution, whether it be practical or educational, be more accessible to those islands that chose to remain within the jurisdiction of the country within which it is they were ultimately colonised. French police and military stationed local would offer the benefit of social stability, and would be the repellent required that made sure China, or more grievously the former Soviet Union, were unable to infiltrate throughout the Cold War years, that if mirrored in consequence of Cuba and Grenada, may have seen embargo or military coup that would mean for a punitively armed nation unnecessary bloodshed of once again the poor, African and indigenous. So take for example, the island that my grandparents were from, Dominica, is sandwiched between Martinique and Guadeloupe. So it's in the middle, and so it could easily have been a French colony, easily, right? And it did go backwards and forwards, but it ended up being English, right? But I've often heard people on the island say, I wish we were like part of the French, because we'd be looked after a lot better, because they can look to the next island and see like you get to like Guadeloupe. Like when I've flown over there, I didn't land there, I don't think, I'm not sure, right? But I'd see like westernized buildings, or like I'd see like high-rise buildings, like tower blocks and stuff like that. when I've not seen that in any other part of the Caribbean that I've been to personally. So there's a little bit more development, you know. And so education wise, you might have bared fruit, and also getting access to education. And if you're talented, you could definitely get access to like football, the soccer system. Yeah. Also the education system in France. So if there's anyone talented or good at what it is that they do, they've got like a line to France. They can literally get shipped to Paris and then develop their talent. When someone who's in the island next door in Dominica, they may have the same talent, but they'll never be recognised or noticed. Like the British haven't got the same link with the Caribbean or with Dominica that they have, that the French have got with Guadeloupe, that treat it as their own country. So like you could be like a footballer playing in like Guadeloupe, and next minute you can actually be playing for the French national team, and technically you can win a World Cup coming from Guadeloupe. But if someone from Dominica could never ever win a football World Cup, but they could have the same talent. So so access to like sporting achievement is curtailed by like half the Caribbean. One of the most athletic sets of people is like they're not like they're blocked from literally ever being able to put a bid in for like winning a tournament, because the countries are so small that they'll never be able to field an 11 strong enough. So that's why I believe they have to join together, really. But that's another story altogether. But can you imagine you've got people who are just equally as talented, but haven't got the same access to education and potential development programs that you would have from someone in Guadeloupe. If they're talented enough, they can get transported to France quite easily and just become a French citizen. So it does have its benefits, yeah. Obviously, as well, like I'm reading online that one thing that is bad is that there's a gun for every 10 people, and they have a serious issue with weapons in Guadeloupe, because guns are getting shipped in from everywhere. So it's not as safe as we probably say it is. However, you know, what didn't happen to it was that in the Cold War years, Russia, the former Soviet Union, was targeting the Caribbean as places to have a base in, so that they could obviously just like dislodge the American supremacy, maybe around the Central and the South American region, but also just cause a little bit of a headache to the Americans, you know. But then also as well, they could potentially have missiles that could be directed towards America and just give America a bit of a headache. And if you did that, like what happened in Grenada, there could be some type of military action that would have seen innocent, once again, Africans and indigenous potentially losing their lives. So that would never happen if they were under French protectorate or under French. But you're vulnerable if you're independent to like a super nation approaching you first with monetary loans, and then obviously getting into your country, and then obviously starting to dictate to you, and they may get you to dictate towards America in a negative way, and that could cause some type of issue. So that wouldn't happen to a country that is technically bounded to another superpower type country. It would be a little bit more difficult, you would like to think, when independent countries that are small and don't have much money are vulnerable to being obviously approached by big organisations. It's just like you've got a small football club with a good player. If the massive club comes in, that player goes, right? No matter what, somehow, some way, right? 9 times out of 10. So yeah. So there's arguments for sort of staying with the colonial country, but then there's arguments for against, because at the end of the day, you want to be independent on your own 2 feet, and they did potentially carry out a lot of wickedness against your ancestors. But sometimes in the world that we live in, you know, being to trade with like European currency, having access, you would think, to like maybe a better medical system, maybe being able to go abroad and develop whatever it is that you've got as a talent, you know, that's a good link to have, you would think, you know, over the years. And it's probably bared fruit, you know, because there's many, just for example, in sports, there's many French footballers that are from the island next door to where my grandparents were from. Many, yeah, from both, right? Not just like Thierry Henry and Nelgraf, Lilian Thuram, you can go on about it, yeah. Will Todd, you can go on about it, yeah, right? And they're just next door, literally the same gene pool, but I haven't seen the same type of development in that respect. And they would have the same type of talent there. It just needs to be mined and developed, but they're not got that opportunity. So that's what could have been good for remaining with the colonial masters. But it's not all about football, but it's a big deal because a lot of money and a lot of exposure, and it just gives you an example of what may have been good about staying with the colony. Anyway, let's move on. From Jamaica to Dominica, in recent times the independent Caribbean islands labelled high risk by standards and poor have now been made vulnerable to wealthy individuals and governments seeking financial return that also hold geopolitical motives centered around grasping a strategic foothold neighbouring the world's largest superpower. What this means is that these governments, poor from inception, are now being progressively debt-riddled to the effect of almost submitting ownership of what should be the ordinary subjects by overseas investors that are building construction at a rapid rate, but not for the societal, political or fiscal gain of the mean Caribbean citizen. Ructions of discontent have been aplenty as Caribbean island chain citizens are being sat in full view of the haves eating up the island space their ancestors grappled and shed blood, sweat and tears of pain and love for, being sold to the effect that the islands are going to be leased back to equal right inhabitants as the rules of investment shed no sympathy. Poor legislation around sovereign ownership rights has made the acquiring of land spaces like Jamaica look like taking candy from a baby. But with money men already teeth sunk into the economic and governmental bloodstream, the fight will be uphill for the Caribbean and her beautiful subjects to regain actual control as the globalist metrosexual agenda tightens its grip. It may be a suggestible idea that for Caribbean ancestors with links to residency qualifying post 300 years of slavery may have to reach a collective parliament that would shelter under one central authority that governs the concerns of the majority, as this could be the only way to barricade themselves against hurricane displacement from home. Yeah, so you'll get like a lot of people via across different types of media and also songs and things like this, stating that the Caribbean's being brought up or they're being indebted to like the superpowers, or they're like being controlled by like either the US, China, Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, etc., not themselves, and it's not, and the actual like the actual average citizen is not benefiting, but they're seeing like wealthy people just take over large swathes of what is the best parts of their particular island, yeah, and they're not seeing any benefit from it apart from being pushed out and prices going up, which you could say is happening here in London, yeah, but obviously the Caribbean is a much smaller land space. It is prime location, it's right next to the USA, and so the land will always be worth something, even though it is like hurricane and sort of maybe volcano and earthquake prone, you could say, but again it's still a prime area of the world, I would like to say. And there it's a battle because of the laws that are in place. Like they're gonna like obviously be giving up more and more of their land space to entities that aren't actually from the Caribbean and maybe even for the Caribbean, so you could see in the next 100 years the actual demographic looking completely different to what it was previously. It doesn't have to be the same. You could see the average person exported out of the country somehow, and then all the rich and famous and whatever else come into the Caribbean and take it over, and it has a completely different look apart from the people that need to work and serve needing places to live. It could just be a rich person's playground, and the actual original Caribbean, you could say, that's been there for hundreds of years, is no more who controls, you know. So that's why I would say, like, obviously they need some type of parliamentary upheaval or change, I would say, if they want to continue and have the same people in charge or the same feel or remember what has gone on just previously in the last few centuries. And obviously they need some type of, that's what I'd said, I just said like maybe some type of parliamentary togetherness where you all vote as one, maybe come together as one, rather than being divided into small, insignificant and not powerful on the international stage islands. You'd be much better served in this modern day, as I can see it, as I can definitely see it. You're better served working together is in one union, as opposed to separate islands making your own independent decisions. Because really, to me, the world has moved on. Like India and China, USA, but India and China, they're not countries. Like they're not continents, but they're like super countries. You can't call a country that's like got 1 billion people in it compared to a place that's got 50,000 or 100,000 or 200,000 in it. How can you call them two countries? They're completely different. One's a mega country stroke a continent, and one is like so to me, like after these places that I'm saying in the Caribbean that are countries, to me, I've renamed them in my mind a long time ago. They're island, I call them island nations, or just islands, but they're not really countries on the scale of like millions of people, you know. So I think like sometimes they need to come together and then they can qualify to be a country. But to me, they're just small island nations, and they're nothing on the global scale, and they never will be unless they stick together and come together and make one significant union, you know. And it'd be a lot easier than all of these other places in Africa, because there's a lot of tribal histrionics that can go back and split people up. But where the resources aren't that heavy, where there's not much to fight, in Africa there's a lot to fight for, resources, why a lot for people to argue over. But you're hoping there's not as much in the Caribbean unless there's a big oil find, which, you know, Jamaica is exploring at the moment. And if they do find oil in Jamaica, they need a good political system, a good judicial system, a good social getting on system, because if not, that's war, right? And I can see it. They need to have all those things sorted. They need to look on even at the Middle East and wherever else and see how these people are controlling their sovereignty. Because if not, it's going to create another Haiti situation if you find oil, and it might not be the best thing for you. But that's another story altogether that I could go into. I was going to write into this and that, but we'll save it for another time. But anyway, that brings this episode to a conclusion. This is the final episode of Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. Yeah, man, I hope you've enjoyed the series. I never thought it would be like 20 odd videos. I thought it'd be about 10 or 15. I thought it'd be about 10 videos, but I made 21 videos, man. So I'm quite impressed with that. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, man. Anyone that's watched it from start to finish, or anyone that does, I really, really appreciate it, even though I can't see it sometimes. And once again, deliver this message straight to your heart, because it's from mine. All right, love, bless, one.